the biggest mistakes that I would see, and I still truly continue to see with women, reach out to work with us, are just super low calorie diets. So putting women of reproductive age in a large caloric deficit and keeping them there. I think, there's this misconception that, nutrition is, in our conventional healthcare system, it's all about energy intake, right? Calories in, calories out. And, female bodies are just much more complex and nuanced than that. And ultimately, we were not designed to operate in a caloric deficit, right? And this puts a lot of stress on the body. And we know that, women with PCOS often have more sensitive stress response systems. They produce more cortisol at baseline, in response to stressors. So if we're throwing women on these really low cal diets, this is like throwing gasoline on the fire and can ultimately make things worse.
Welcome to Hopeful and Wholesome, the show where ambitious women come home to their bodies. I'm your host, Hope Pedraza, and I'm a functional practitioner, human design guide, and expert on all things energy, and your partner in decoding the language of your body. This is your space to reconnect with your body's wisdom, reclaim your energy, and rise into alignment in your health, your business, and your life. Because thriving isn't about pushing harder, it's about learning to listen deeper. So let's dive in, because your next breakthrough starts right now. Hey y'all, welcome back to Hopeful and Wholesome. Today I have on the show Jillian Greaves, and she is a functional dietitian and women's health specialist and the owner of her private practice, Jillian Greaves Functional Nutrition and Wellness. And she's the creator of the PCOS Root Reversal Program. She provides comprehensive nutrition and lifestyle counseling to women with a special emphasis on PCOS, hormone balance, and digestive health. Jillian and her team help women identify and address the root cause of their hormone and digestive symptoms using labs, personalized nutrition, and supportive lifestyle therapies. And it's her mission to empower women to take back control of their health, reclaim their confidence, and experience life at its fullest. And today we are talking all things hormones, specifically talking about how blood sugar impacts our hormones. We talk about PCOS, but then we also talk about hormones just in a broad sense and the things that we can do to help bring balance back to our hormones. Things like circadian rhythm and how that affects insulin resistance and affects inflammation. We talk about why period pain is not normal and PMS is not normal and what we can do. So if you are a woman with hormones, which is everyone listening, whether you think you have hormones left or not, this episode is going to be helpful, because I say this in the episode, but even if you don't have PCOS, even if you're not a menstruating woman anymore, like you don't have a period anymore, everything that Jillian talks about is so applicable to everyone and just keeping balance to our bodies. So let's jump in. All right, y'all, I'm here with Jillian. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jillian.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to jump into this conversation all about hormones, and we'll see where it takes us. I know that your area of expertise is really PCOS, which I love because we haven't really dove into that specifically on the show. We've talked about hormones in plenty of context. I would love to know, before we dive into like the juicy stuff, what kind of led you, just kind of your story of what brought you here. Everybody's got an origin story of why they chose the topic that they like to teach about and help people with. And so do you have your own journey with PCOS? So what drove you to this avenue?
Yeah, great question. So I definitely had my own health journey and health challenges that led me to the functional nutrition world and really looking for deeper root causes and, really root cause solutions with my own health. When it comes to, and I'll just, kind of broadly say that involved a very rocky transition off hormonal birth control and, a lot of, unaddressed stress and, changes that needed to happen, with my own diet lifestyle that just weren't really part of my conventional training. So personal experiences really brought me to want to specialize in women's health and, hormones, as well as, seek out advanced training in functional nutrition. In terms of PCOS specifically, I started my career as a dietitian, working as an outpatient dietitian in a big Boston hospital in an endocrinology department, where I was like ready to dive in and change the world. And I came up against some really big barriers in my experience working in that environment. And I worked with a lot of women with PCOS in this kind of conventional healthcare setting. And what I was seeing is that a lot of, young women of reproductive age were, coming into the clinic struggling with a lot of symptoms and were recommended a whole slew of medications for suppressing symptoms. It's the birth control for the irregular periods, the metformin for, the weight, the spironolactone for the acne. And women were put on a lot of medications that were geared toward symptom suppression or symptom management. And I always like to preface this by saying I am never, anti-medication, and I always respect an individual's autonomy to make decisions about medication that feel best for them. But in this environment, I was seeing that, women were only offered medication as a tool, again, for symptom suppression. And, ultimately, these are kind of big fat Band-Aids. We're not getting at the root of the problem. We're not asking questions, why are we experiencing these symptoms? And, women were also being put on really restrictive diets that, I saw was making their symptoms worse and creating a lot more stress. And that's where I became really interested in, PCOS specifically, and really kind of diving into learning more about, PCOS root causes, and started actually, seeing clients on my own on the side, and was seeing really incredible results with actually targeting root causes and supporting women with, nutrition and lifestyle. So really, to long-winded answer to your question, definitely some personal health challenges I think brought me to the women's health space, and kind of sparked my interest in functional medicine, and then experiences working in a healthcare setting with a lot of women that had PCOS is what really drove me to want to support women differently and to offer women really the support that I feel they deserve, on their health and healing journeys.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's huge. And I think coming from, I've had various types of practitioners on who have come from kind of that conventional world into the more like functional or quote unquote alternative world, or integrative, whatever word you want to use. And for that reason, where it's like, do we want to continue? And again, I'm with you. Like, there's never no judgment on anybody who decides they need medication or they decide like autonomy 100%. But at the same time, if you really are trying to heal, then we need to not put Band-Aids on things. So I think that's been a kind of a common thread with the practitioners we've had on the show, where it's like you saw a need, and the need was like you said, women deserve better, and they deserve other options, and not to have this be the only option is the medication or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned the diet. I would love to hear your thoughts on the diet part, because you mentioned that the conventional ways are kind of putting women on these restrictive diets. So what did you see as some big mistakes that were made in that area? I'd love to hear your experience.
Yeah, the biggest mistakes that I would see, and I still truly continue to see with women that reach out to work with us, are just super low calorie diets. So putting women of reproductive age in a large caloric deficit and keeping them there. I think, there's this misconception that nutrition is, in our conventional healthcare system, it's all about energy intake, right? Calories in, calories out. And, female bodies are just much more complex and nuanced than that. And ultimately, we were not designed to operate in a caloric deficit, right? And this puts a lot of stress on the body. And we know that, women with PCOS often have more sensitive stress response systems. They produce more cortisol at baseline, in response to stressors. So if we're throwing women on these really low cal diets, this is like throwing gasoline on the fire and can ultimately make things worse. The other biggest mistake I would see, in that conventional setting, and I still see, to this day, is putting women with PCOS on ultra low carb diets. And, I think because many women, the large majority of women with PCOS do experience some degree of insulin resistance and issues with blood sugar regulation, the knee-jerk reaction is often, okay, so I have to cut carbs or go low carb.
Yep.
But ultimately, this is another Band-Aid in my mind, in that if we're having issues with insulin resistance, we need to sensitize our cells to insulin. We need to support that insulin sensitivity and get the body, utilizing, glucose and energy more efficiently. And what I will often see in women with PCOS on these low carb diets is a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of cravings, for carbs, for sugar, overeating later in the day. And it creates this really vicious cycle. So I think the demonization of carbohydrates is, a big mistake that I've seen happening for a while now. And ultimately, we want to find that sweet spot for women in terms of, adequate nourishment and utilizing, carbohydrates to fuel and nourish their body in the context of great blood sugar stability.
Yeah, I see that one as a big one. And I mean, there's people who their whole job is getting women on the low carb diets to help with PCOS. So that's a real thing. So what is your recommendation to kind of help? Because you're right. I mean, the insulin, and I've worked with a handful of women with PCOS, so I'm familiar with this too. And the metformin, it's like, oh, we'll just get on metformin and get that's a whole thing. But when you want to help the body's response to insulin and without going low carb, what are you recommending?
Yeah, great question. And I think first and foremost, I always recommend starting with the foundations and, working our way up from there. So when I say foundations, I'm talking about, basic meal frequency or meal timing. Are we, eating consistent meals throughout the day? That is key and essential. It's not super sexy to talk about, but for supporting, blood sugar stability. Also thinking about basic meal composition in terms of, having a good carb source at meals, ideally a great, fiber rich carb or a slow burning carb. But pairing that with adequate protein, healthy fats, ample non-starchy veggies, and all of these elements together can really help to, elongate that blood sugar curve and prevent, big spikes and crashes. Outside of that, in terms of thinking about the insulin sensitivity, some big things I think about are stress. So, focusing on, nervous system support, nervous system outlets is huge. We could have the, most perfectly well-balanced blood sugar supportive meal that we're eating. But if stress is through the roof, that's going to have a significant impact on how we process that meal and our insulin sensitivity. I also think about, things like sleep and circadian rhythms. So sleep and circadian rhythms are huge when it comes to, cellular insulin sensitivity. So if there's opportunities to, kind of dial in a more optimal sleep schedule, to consider what's going on with light regulation in terms of, making sure we're getting adequate sunlight exposure in the morning and midday, ideally minimizing our exposure to, blue light emitting devices at night, all of which, if there's wonkiness with light regulation, can really disrupt our cellular insulin sensitivity. I also think about things like minerals and mineral support, which play a big role with insulin sensitivity, our magnesium, potassium, sodium. I think about movement. So if we want to improve our cellular insulin sensitivity, if we tend to, eat a meal at our desk during the day, we're eating and working and, not moving, this can impact things. So maybe we eat and we pop outside for a short walk. So working on integrating, small bouts of movement. Those are some we could definitely go down a rabbit hole here, but I'd say those are some big things that I think anyone could benefit from that can make a really big difference with insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, those were so helpful. Thank you for sharing those. And I think you made a point, and I like to say it all the time, like I feel, well, maybe not none of it, but I feel like a lot of this stuff are like the sexy things people want to talk about, like talk about sleep and your circadian rhythm. And because it seems so basic and simple, like, okay, duh, like make it dark and go to sleep. Like it sounds so simple,
Right.
but they really are the things that I feel like the majority of busy women struggle with the most. Like these are the things that we let go, by the wayside or whatever. So I think it's worth mentioning those. I had a whole episode earlier this year on talking about circadian rhythm and like chronobiology and how that affects your body. So that's a big one. And I said that in the episode too. Like, I know this sounds so basic, but it's really not. Like it's really, it's not something that a lot of us are consciously or intentional about. And there was this, my husband sent me, I think it was yesterday, the day before, he sent me this thing on Instagram. It was this article study that showed that even the smallest bit of light, like when you're sleeping, even the smallest bit of dim light impacts your insulin response at night. It increases your chance of diabetes. Like I forget the percent, but it was a substantial number. Like increases your, and I'm like, what? Like that is crazy. Just having light on at night, like having it not be dark, that affects your, it's nuts.
It really is nuts. And it's, it's not, the sexiest or exciting to talk about, but those small tweaks are so profound.
Right.
I often say one of the biggest disruptors to hormonal health that people are not talking about enough is circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
There was actually a study done. It's a little bit older. I want to say it was like from maybe 2014, but they actually took a group of healthy individuals and disrupted their circadian rhythms for 3 weeks by keeping them up later and exposing them to blue light at night. At the end of 3 weeks, this group of individuals had pre-diabetic levels of fasting glucose and fasting insulin.
That's crazy.
And this was what was wild, experienced over an 8% decrease in their BMR, in their metabolism.
Holy cow. Just 3 weeks.
With just 3 weeks.
Crazy.
And on the flip side, the cool thing is that, in this study, when they, flipped their schedules and, kind of restored their sleep schedule and minimized the blue light exposure at night, all of those things resolved, right?
Back. Wow.
But I think it speaks to the fact too, that like, in our modern world, these types of habits in terms of like keeping it, dim in the evening, not getting exposed to screens, keeping it really dark in, the bedroom, getting sunlight in the morning. These things aren't like intuitive anymore, right? Because our modern world is kind of like working against us in that sense. So I do find, these changes aren't crazy, but they do require some intention, since I think it's just, again, our modern world kind of makes it a little harder to do those things.
Yeah, no, I agree. The other thing you said I wanted to point out too, and I think this is another one that we forget about, or it's something that a lot of people just don't know. But you mentioned stress, but I think we forget that cortisol is a stress response, and cortisol and blood sugar move together. So when your cortisol is spiking, your blood sugar is going to spike. Like knowing that there was, I had a gal. Oh, was she on my podcast or I was on her podcast? No, I was on her podcast. We were talking about this. And she was saying that she wanted to like experiment with one of those continuous glucose monitors. And because she felt like she had like a blood sugar thing, she was doing it on her own. And she said, I did not. And she's a very smart, like she's in tune with her body and she's, she knows nutrition things, but she's like, I really did not understand how much stress impacted me. She's like, I would eat everything I ate. It was fine. Like no spike, whatever. But there's a specific situation where it was like a really stressful situation at like a store or something. And then she got this alert on her phone that was like, whatever, her spike, and it was the stress. She was like, holy cow, I had no idea stress did that to my blood sugar.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up, because I think it's not talked about enough. And food is so important, but I think sometimes we can get lost in the weeds with just looking at food, and we forget to zoom out and look at the bigger picture and that overall context. And it's so true. Cortisol's high, glucose is going to be high. And for most of us, stress is pretty pervasive, right? And obviously there's, stressors that are not in our control. But I think, a lot of us have sort of adapted to operating in like a chronic state of fight or flight, right? Our nervous systems are, at baseline often dysregulated. And, you can't help but think how is this chronic repeated stress and, elevation with cortisol impacting our blood sugar and our metabolic health and our hormones. So yeah, such a huge connection there between, cortisol and glucose. And I think CGMs can be so eye-opening for kind of highlighting some of those variables that I don't think we realize, how significantly they impact blood sugar.
For sure. And it's especially for those of us who are like, I'm doing all the right things and I'm eating balanced meals and I'm not, and then it's like, well, yeah, it's the stress that's jacking up your blood sugar all day. I mean, I think we really just, I think the other part of that is what you kind of just said that, but how our body adapts to being in that fight or flight state. So then it just becomes your new normal and it's just how you operate. It's like your new operating system is that. And it's like, well, yeah, you can function, but it's still this internal chaos is still going on under the surface with your
totally. Yeah. And it's, I think we sort of have a very narrow view of like what stress is nowadays, where we think about stress as this like huge, significant, acute stressor, right? It's, a significant life event. It's like a huge deadline at work or a presentation. And we forget that, the body perceives just like the day-to-day grind and the to-do list as a stressor. It makes me think about this client that my team is working with that has a very calm demeanor and, in terms of reporting her stress levels is like, yeah, I'm not, not particularly stressed. And, with testing her hormones, we saw something very different in terms of, really, lots of issues with elevation with cortisol. There can be lots of patterns with cortisol. It's not always high, but in this case it was. And actually with her aura data, when we were looking into it, her aura was reporting like 10 hours of stress a day and, 10 minutes of restorative time.
Oh, no.
And right. And so, again, I think, and she's very busy and has a big job and just sort of has normalized that day-to-day grind. So it's been, and we'll see that a lot where I think, again, our baseline has shifted. And it's important to remember that like stress comes in all different shapes and sizes, and more so than ever in our modern world, I think we have to be really proactive about nervous system support, not just when we're experiencing that like acute extreme stress.
Right. That's it. And that's a big one. I mean, if you wait till you're already stressed, you kind of miss the boat. Like we got to do that preemptively and like have that be the normal is like doing the nervous system work. The other thing I want to ask you about before we run out of time, the other thing I want to ask you about is talking about PMS. And I know something that you believe is that PMS and period pain are not necessarily normal and that, you don't necessarily have to suffer through your period. So if you want to just speak on that for a minute and just for the women out there, for the menstruating women out there who are listening, I know we have a mixture of menopause, postmenopause, and premenopause, but for those who have a period, just your take on that and any insight you have on that. Because I know a lot of women, so many women struggle with that, with their periods.
Yeah, I love that question. And what I always like to say is that period-related symptoms, so period pain being a big one, but also, fatigue, significant mood-related shifts, digestive symptoms, bloating. These symptoms are normalized, but they are not normal.
Right.
What I will say is that it is normal and expected to, experience some subtle shifts or differences with how we feel throughout the menstrual cycle. We're not robots, and, shifts with hormones, they impact our physiology and, ultimately feeling, a little bit more tired pre-period or, noticing some subtle shifts that indicate, your period's coming, that can be normal. Shifts that are significant or disruptive are not normal. And I really consider these SOS signals or essentially a way that, your body is communicating with you that something is off or things are off. Periods should not be painful. They should not be super heavy. We shouldn't experience drastic mood shifts or, crazy fatigue. So again, I really consider these symptoms a way that the body communicates with us that it needs some support or we need to make some adjustments.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some things women can do to help improve? Like, and I know that's probably a loaded question, but if you want to just give a few, but things that women can do to help offset that and set themselves up for a more painless period.
Yeah, great question. And I always default to, like, first and foremost, look at your foundations, because, there's definitely, micro strategies and a lot of ways you can get targeted with specific symptoms, or if we have lab data to understand those symptoms. But we don't want to miss the forest for the trees. If our foundation isn't in place, and we're like jumping ahead to focus on all these, micro strategies, we may not see the movement with our symptoms and our health that we want. So always assess your foundations first and foremost. What's going on with your blood sugar basics, so that, meal timing and frequency, our basic meal composition, really, making sure we're eating enough, we're nourishing adequately. So always checking in on some of those foundations, thinking about sleep, thinking about nervous system support. Also assessing movement and kind of the context of movement. Something I will see with clients is, women who are going to like Orange Theory or, these intense boot camp classes, 3 to 5 days a week, all month long, right? And, maybe they feel great doing these things at one point in their cycle. But if we're, kind of pounding the pavement and putting too much stress on the body, say during the luteal phase or pre-period, when the body is already under a lot more stress from what's going on hormonally, this can definitely amplify a lot of symptoms. Mm-hmm. So I'd start with, kind of auditing and making any appropriate adjustments to those foundational pieces, which alone truly can often make a big difference. Yeah. From there, I would, definitely consider looking at things like, mineral intake and supporting minerals. Magnesium can be a really key one, but magnesium, sodium, and potassium for sure. Also thinking about, increasing your intake of, anti-inflammatory foods. Oftentimes period pain in particular, there can be a variety of reasons for it. But it's often related to the overproduction of prostaglandins, or these inflammatory molecules that we, produce pre-period and with the onset of our period. And we can often combat some of that with really amping up the anti-inflammatories. So that could be, bright, colorful fruits and veggies, fermented foods, fatty fish, green tea, herbs and spices, things like ginger, garlic. And so really kind of focusing on those anti-inflammatories can be helpful. I'm also a big advocate of things like castor oil packs. I don't know if you've talked about those on here. Yeah, I figured. Mm-hmm. So castor oil packs can be, a really excellent tool for providing a little bit of support. So I'd work through some of those things first. And ultimately, if you're not seeing resolution with those symptoms or significant movement towards resolution, that may be an indication that you need to connect with a practitioner that, understands, female physiology, to do a little bit of deeper digging, to get a sense of what's going on a deeper level. And that's where you can kind of get a little bit more targeted. But many women may not need to go that far, right, if they, kind of really dial in those foundations.
Yeah, no, those are really good tips. I appreciate you sharing those. And I love that. I'm a huge opponent of cycle syncing. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, the working out part, when we talk about work and working out and food and all that, because it does make a difference with how your body responds to, that phase. So yeah, I love that you mentioned that. This is so good and so informative. And I think everyone who has hormones can benefit from listening to this, because even if you don't have painful periods, even if you don't have PCOS, all of these, like even just the list you just laid out for us right there, all of that can benefit you and your overall well-being. So all of those were helpful. Totally. So thank you for that and for sharing your insight. I have one more question that I want to ask you, but before I ask you that, can you let everybody know where they can find out about you and working with you and everything that you're doing?
Absolutely. So you can learn more about me, my team, and kind of how we work with women on my website, which is just jilliangreaves.com. You can also follow me on Instagram. My handle is just Jillian Greaves RD, and I'm always kind of, sharing nutrition, lifestyle, hormone health tips over there, and can totally feel free to reach out via DMs as well.
Perfect. And of course, all that will be in the show notes. You can go check those links out and give Jillian a follow. And the last question I want to ask you that I like to ask everybody, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
I love that question. I think the most important thing you could do to live with purpose is, I think this is probably, might be, tell me if this is a little bit too, broad or vague. But I think in terms of living with purpose, really, I think getting comfortable with saying no, and, only saying yes if it's a hell yes. So, I don't know if that's a little off from what you were thinking about, but I think, getting really comfortable with making decisions that feel incredibly aligned and being comfortable and confident with saying no to things that are not in line, aligned, I think, really organically helps me and helps women really, live with more purpose. So
yeah. There are no wrong answers here. So all answers are welcome. I had a guy ask me a couple weeks ago, he's like, do you ever have any answers where you're like, oh God, I'm like, no, really, they're all great answers. And I love that because we talk about that a lot on the show. I had a whole episode on setting boundaries, and I had a whole episode on listening to like your gut and your decisions and only saying yes to things that light you up. So we talk about these things all the time. So everything you said is resonant to things we talk about on the show. But I love that, and I do think that being able to know what is a hell yes for you and what's a no, that really does. I mean, it does align you with your purpose and knowing exactly what lights you up and brings you joy and leads you to be more fulfilled. So I agree with all of that. I love that answer. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, Jillian. Thank you for this and sharing all of your wisdom with us. And y'all check out Jillian on the gram, give her a follow. And thanks so much, Jillian.
Thank you.